When my sister Valerie looked my healing son in the eye and told him burgers were only for young people with a future, I didn't scream. I'm Annette Sterling, 51, an escrow processor from Spokane, and I'm about to show you how a quiet mother rewrites the ledger of a family's cruelty. For 30 years, I've worked in the back offices of Inland Empire Title and Escrow. If you've ever bought a home in Eastern Washington, chances are my initials are on the bottom of your closing disclosure. I am the woman who verifies the liens, tracks down the missing heirs, and ensures that every penny of a multi-million-dollar transaction lands exactly where it belongs. It's quiet, meticulous work. It doesn't make you rich, but it teaches you one very important lesson. People always leave a paper trail, especially when they think they're too smart to get caught. I raised my son, Leo, on a single escrow processor's salary. His father left us when Leo was just a toddler, leaving behind nothing but a stack of past due notices and a rusted-out Ford. We didn't have much. Our home is a modest, two-bedroom bungalow in North Spokane with laminate countertops and a porch that needs painting. But we had love and we had dignity. Then, 2 years ago, the world stopped. A distracted driver crossed the center line on Highway 2, hitting Leo's compact car head-on. Leo was 19. He spent 3 weeks in a medically induced coma, and the doctors told me to prepare for the worst. But my boy is a fighter. He survived, though the trauma left him with a severe limp and a cognitive delay that makes his speech slow and deliberate. He has to search for his words sometimes, his brow furrowing as he reaches for the right syllable. To me, every slow, hard-won word he speaks is a miracle. To my family, however, Leo became a tragedy they preferred not to look at, an inconvenience. If you've ever had to sit at a kitchen table and choose between paying the electric bill or funding another week of physical therapy for your child, you know the kind of tired that settles deep into your bones. It's a heavy, quiet weight. But you carry it because you love them. You carry it because there is no other choice. This past weekend was my sister Valerie's annual midsummer barbecue. Valerie married Richard, a local commercial developer who built his fortune by cutting corners on suburban strip malls. They live in a sprawling, glass and timber estate on the shores of Liberty Lake. It's the kind of house where everything is white, expensive, and cold. Valerie has always looked down on me. To her, my modest life is a personal affront to the family name. Her son, Julian, is the same age as Leo. Before the accident, Leo and Julian were close. But while Leo was learning how to walk again, Julian was driving a brand new BMW and bragging about his guaranteed spot at a prestigious Seattle law school. When we arrived at the lake house on Saturday, the heat was stifling. The air smelled of cedar oil, expensive sunscreen, and the rich, smoky scent of prime Wagyu beef grilling on Richard's commercial-grade patio setup. Leo, despite his heavy limp, immediately set to work helping. He spent 2 hours carrying heavy bags of ice, unfolding heavy lawn chairs, and sweeping the cedar deck for his aunt. He didn't complain once. He just smiled, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, happy to be included. By 5 o'clock, the food was ready. Richard was plating thick, juicy Wagyu burgers, the fat sizzling beautifully over the coals. My mother, Beatrice, was sitting in a padded lounger, sipping Pinot Grigio, while Julian leaned against the railing, loudly telling a story about a weekend trip to Vegas. Leo, who had skipped lunch to finish his physical therapy exercises, walked up to the grill. He held out a paper plate, his hand trembling slightly, a lingering effect of the neurological damage. "Uncle? Uncle Richard," Leo said, his voice slow, his eyes bright with hope. "Those smell really amazing. Could I please have one of those burgers?" Before Richard could answer, Valerie stepped forward. She was wearing a pristine white linen dress, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the afternoon sun. She looked at Leo's plate, then up at his face with a look of patronizing pity that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Leo, sweetie," Valerie said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Those Wagyu patties are imported. We really only have enough for the young people with a real future ahead of them. You know, the ones who are going to be building careers and contributing." She patted his cheek, a gesture so deeply condescending it felt like a slap. "There are some cheap hot dogs in the kitchen wrapper. You don't mind going inside and boiling one for yourself, do you?" The deck fell dead silent. I looked at my mother, Beatrice. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked out over the lake, pretending she hadn't heard. I looked at Richard, who simply shrugged and turned a burger over with his silver spatula. Julian let out a low, mocking chuckle, taking a slow sip of his beer. I looked at my son. Leo stood there, his paper plate shaking. His ears turned a bright, painful red. He looked down at his worn-out sneakers, his shoulders slumping. He didn't argue. He didn't have the words to defend himself in that moment. He just looked smaller, as if he were trying to shrink into the wood planks of the deck. If you have ever had to watch your child's spirit get crushed by the very people who are supposed to protect them, you know the exact temperature your blood turns. It doesn't boil. It turns to ice. I walked over to Leo. I gently took the paper plate from his hand and set it down on Valerie's pristine outdoor dining table. I took my small brass measuring tape out of my purse, the one I've carried for 25 years, my tool of the trade, and set it right next to her glass of wine. It was a small, heavy piece of metal, worn smooth at the edges. "We're leaving," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake, but it had a weight to it that made Valerie's smile falter. "Oh, Annette, don't be so sensitive," Valerie sighed, rolling her eyes. "It's just practical. Julian needs the protein for his training, and Leo really shouldn't be eating such heavy red meat anyway with his condition." I didn't answer her. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a scene. I just put my arm around Leo's shoulders and walked him down the grand stone steps, past the manicured lawns, and back to my beat-up Subaru. The drive back to North Spokane was completely silent. Leo stared out the passenger window, his hand resting on his knee. When we got home, I didn't say a word about what happened. I just went into our kitchen, pulled out a couple of simple, store-bought beef patties from our freezer, and fried them up in my cast-iron skillet. I served them on toasted buns with a side of home-cooked fries. Leo ate in silence. When he finished, he looked up at me, his eyes shiny. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. "These are better, anyway." "I know, baby," I said, leaning over to kiss the top of his head. "Go get some rest." After he went upstairs, I sat at my laminate kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt the tears finally coming, hot and angry, spilling over my cheeks. I thought about Valerie's sparkling white dress, Richard's smug grin, and the absolute certainty they had that we were nothing. They believed our poverty and Leo's injury made us powerless. But as an escrow processor, I know something they forgot. Power isn't about who has the loudest voice or the most expensive grill. Power is about who holds the deed. I sat there for hours, the tea in my mug turning cold. Then, at exactly 11:57 p.m., my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Leo. He was upstairs in his room, unable to sleep, but he hadn't sent a message of sadness. He had sent a link to a private local news forum, followed by a short message. The text read, "Mom, remember what Aunt Valerie said about who has a future? But now he is." I clicked the link. My breath caught in my throat as the page loaded, revealing a booking mugshot from the Spokane County Sheriff's Department. There, staring back at the camera with bloodshot eyes and a bruised forehead, was Julian, the golden boy, the young man with the future. According to the police report, Julian had been arrested 2 hours prior for a high-speed, felony DUI collision. He had crashed his brand-new BMW into a parked utility truck on Division Street, but it wasn't just a simple traffic arrest. The report noted that the passenger in his car, a young woman, was currently in the ICU at Sacred Heart Medical Center in critical condition. Julian had attempted to flee the scene on foot before being tackled by deputies. But the detail that made my heart stop, the detail that only an escrow officer would notice, was the vehicle registration and the bail amount. The BMW was registered to Richard's Primary Development Corporation, Pioneer Holdings, LLC, and the bail had been set at a staggering $250,000, cash only, due to the flight risk and the severity of the passenger's injuries. I stared at the glowing screen, the cold tea forgotten as a slow, calculating heat began to replace the ice in my veins. I knew Pioneer Holdings. In fact, just 3 weeks ago, Richard had come into my office at Inland Empire Title, demanding we expedite the closing on his newest commercial acquisition on North Division. He had been desperate, sweating through his expensive polo shirt, pushing for a quick release of the escrow funds. At the time, I thought it was just typical developer greed. But now, looking at the mugshot and knowing the strict covenants of commercial escrow law, the pieces of a much larger, much dirtier puzzle began to fall into place. Richard didn't have the cash. He was leveraged to the hilt, and his golden boy had just handed me the key to his vault. The screen of my phone cast a cold blue glow across my face as I sat alone at my kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing heavy against my ears. Upstairs, Leo was asleep, his breathing soft and rhythmic, a quiet testament to the life we had fought so hard to rebuild. But down here, in the dark, the image of my nephew Julian's swollen, arrogant face stared back at me from the county booking page. Those are only for young people with a real future ahead of them. My sister Valerie's voice echoed in my head, sharp and venomous, a contrast to the quiet dignity my son had shown when he walked away with his empty paper plate. She had judged my boy's worth by his slower speech and his halting step. She had decided that because Leo had suffered a tragedy, he no longer deserved a seat at the table. But as I stared at Julian's mugshot, at the charge of felony DUI with vehicular assault, I realized the universe has a very particular way of balancing the books. Julian's future hadn't just stalled. It had collided head-on with a utility truck at 70 miles an hour, leaving a young girl fighting for her life in the ICU. Now, I know some of you sitting at your own tables tonight might think that a mother's first instinct would be to celebrate. You might think I felt a rush of cheap satisfaction seeing my sister's golden boy brought low. But I didn't. When you've spent 30 years processing escrow, you lose the capacity for sudden, explosive emotions. You learn to look at crises the way a surgeon looks at an incision. You don't scream. You locate the source of the bleeding. The source of Valerie and Richard's pride was their money. Specifically, the illusion of it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my worn table, cradling a chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold, and did what I do best. I followed the paper trail. In the escrow world, we have access to databases the general public rarely sees. We see the tax liens before they're published. We see the LI's pendants, the notices of pending lawsuits, before they're officially served. We see the private mortgage agreements, the UCC filing statements, and the corporate operating agreements that reveal who actually owns the dirt beneath our feet. By 2 a.m., I had logged into our secure title plant system using my remote credentials. Pioneer Holdings LLC, Richard's development company, was the primary owner of the $4.2 million commercial development on North Division Street. The closing was scheduled in our office for this coming Friday. I was the designated escrow processor. I pulled up the file, my fingers flying over the keyboard, the familiar clack of the keys a comforting rhythm in the quiet house. To close this deal, Richard was relying on a $3.2 million commercial acquisition loan from Columbia River Capital, a conservative private lending group based out of Seattle. The remaining $1 million was supposed to come from Richard's own cash reserves. In escrow, we call this the buyer's equity contribution. It must be deposited into our trust account via wire transfer at least 24 hours before closing. But as I dug deeper into Pioneer Holdings' corporate structure, I noticed a red flag. Richard didn't have $1 million in cash. To secure his equity contribution, Richard had taken out a short-term, high-interest bridge loan, cross-collateralized by his personal residence, the sprawling, white-on-white glass and timber estate on Liberty Lake. The lender for that bridge loan was a secondary firm that required a clean, unencumbered title on the lake house. And that was where Richard's house of cards began to wobble. At 7:30 a.m. on Monday morning, I walked into the lobby of Inland Empire Title and Escrow. The air smelled of stale carpet cleaner and the cheap hazelnut creamer my co-worker, Darlene, always kept in the break room fridge. Darlene was already there, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, her desk illuminated by the harsh glare of her dual monitors. Darlene has been our senior title examiner for 25 years. She is a woman who wears comfortable orthopedic shoes, keeps a jar of peppermint candies on her desk, and knows the exact volume and page number of every easement dispute in Spokane County. She is also the only person in the office who knew how hard I had struggled to pay Leo's medical bills. "Annette, you look like you haven't slept a wink," Darlene said, her voice a raspy, comforting purr as I set my purse down. "Is Leo okay?" "Leo is doing well, Darlene," I said, leaning against her cubicle wall, holding my favorite blue ceramic mug. "But I need a favor, a big one, and it needs to stay between us." Darlene lowered her glasses, her sharp eyes scanning my face. She didn't ask questions. She just reached into her desk, pulled out a peppermint, and popped it into her mouth. "Name it." "I need the wet ink signature files and the pending recording cue for Richard Sterling's personal property on Liberty Lake. I also need to see if any emergency filings have come in this morning from the Spokane County Superior Court regarding Pioneer Holdings, LLC. Darlene's eyebrows shot up. Richard was my brother-in-law, and she knew the family dynamics. She didn't say a word about the barbecue or the gossip. She just turned to her keyboard, her fingers moving with the speed of a seasoned professional. "Give me 10 minutes, she whispered. I walked back to my desk, my heart thumping against my ribs. If you've ever had to cross a line to protect your own, you know that cold sweat that breaks out on the back of your neck. You're not doing it for greed. You're doing it because the people who were supposed to love you have proven they will step on your child's face to keep their own shoes clean." 10 minutes later, Darlene walked into my office. She didn't have a file in her hands. That would leave a physical trail. Instead, she leaned over my shoulder and pointed to my screen, where she had shared a secure link to the county auditor's pending recording cue. "Look at this, Annette," Darlene whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint. "It came in at 8:01 a.m. The attorney representing the family of the girl Julian hit last night. They didn't waste any time." I stared at the screen. It was an emergency petition for a prejudgment writ of attachment. Because the BMW Julian was driving was registered to Pioneer Holdings, LLC, the victim's attorney was seeking to freeze all assets of the corporation to prevent Richard from transferring or hiding funds before a civil lawsuit could be filed. The writ hadn't been signed by a judge yet. That would take 24 to 48 hours, but the petition itself was now a matter of public record. And in the strict, unforgiving covenants of commercial lending, a pending writ of attachment against the borrowing entity is a fatal blow. If Columbia River Capital found out about this petition, they would pull their $3.2 million loan in a heartbeat. "But that's not all," Darlene said, her finger tapping the glass of my monitor. "Look at the bridge loan on the Liberty Lake house. Richard's attorney submitted the deed of trust for recording last Friday afternoon. But there was a clerical error. The legal description of the property listed the wrong plat map. The county auditor rejected the filing and sent it back to his attorney for correction." My breath hitched. Because the deed of trust had been rejected, the bridge loan lender had not yet officially secured their lien on the lake house. Technically, Richard had already received the funds. The $1 million equity contribution was currently sitting in our escrow trust account, waiting for Friday's closing. But the lender had no idea their security interest wasn't legally recorded. If the bridge loan lender discovered that their deed of trust was defective and that a prejudgment writ of attachment was about to hit Pioneer Holdings, LLC, they would immediately recall the loan. They would freeze the funds currently sitting in our escrow account. Richard was completely exposed. He was holding a $1 million check that didn't legally belong to him, trying to close a $4.2 million deal, while his son's victim lay in a hospital bed and his own company was about to be frozen by the courts. "Annette," Darlene said softly, her hand resting on my shoulder, "if you process this closing without disclosing these material changes to the lenders, you could lose your license. But if you do disclose them?" "If I disclose them," I said, my voice steady, "the deal falls apart. Richard defaults on his purchase contract. He loses his $150,000 non-refundable earnest money, and the seller will immediately cancel the contract and move to the backup offer." "And who is the backup offer?" Darlene asked. I looked down at the physical file on my desk. I knew exactly who the backup buyer was. It was a local non-profit community health organization that had been trying to buy that exact strip mall for 3 years to turn it into a low-cost physical therapy and rehabilitation clinic for brain trauma survivors. The very clinic Leo needed. The very clinic Richard had outbid them on by cutting corners and using dirty money. I looked at the worn brass measuring tape sitting on my desk, the one I had placed on Valerie's table just 2 days ago. I knew what I had to do. The law is a beautiful thing. It doesn't care about your wealth, your expensive white dresses, or your imported Wagyu beef. It only cares about the signatures on the paper, the dates on the stamps, and the absolute truth of the record. My sister had told my son he had no future, but she had forgotten that the future isn't something given to you by the wealthy. It is something built, piece by piece, document by document, by the people who know how to work in the dark. I looked up at Darlene, a slow, quiet smile spreading across my face. "Darlene," I said, "let's go to work." I reached for my phone, my fingers steady as I prepared to draft the first of several very precise, very legal emails that would set the trap. The phone on my desk rang at exactly 9:15 on Monday morning. The caller ID displayed Richard's private cell number. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring 3 times, watching the plastic console flash in the dim light of my cubicle, before I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Inland Empire Title and Escrow, this is Annette," I said, my voice smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of the ice that had settled in my chest since Saturday afternoon. "Annette, thank God." Richard's voice came through the line, loud and strained. The usual booming confidence, the wealthy developer's swagger that he wore like an expensive cologne, was completely gone. In its place was a frantic, breathless rattle. "Look, we need to expedite the North Division closing. I need those escrow funds released by Wednesday morning. Can we do that? Tell me we can do that." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of the brass measuring tape sitting next to my keyboard. "The scheduled closing date is Friday, Richard. Commercial files require a 48-hour document review period once the lender's instructions are received. Is there a problem?" "No, no problem," he stammered, though I could hear the papers rustling frantically on his end of the line. "Just some cash flow adjustments. We've got some unexpected expenses come up. Family stuff. You've probably seen the news about Julian. It's a misunderstanding, Annette, a complete fabrication by some overzealous deputies. But we need to retain a high-end defense firm out of Seattle, and they want a $50,000 retainer by tomorrow afternoon. I need my equity draw from the Pioneer transaction to clear." I sat in the quiet of my office, listening to my brother-in-law breathe heavily into the receiver. He hadn't asked how Leo was doing. He hadn't apologized for his wife telling my disabled son that he had no future while his own son was currently sitting in a county jail cell after destroying a young girl's life. He just wanted his money. He wanted me to bend the rules, to bypass the legal waiting periods, to help him pull his golden boy out of the mud. "I see," I said softly. "I'm processing the file as we speak, Richard. I'll do everything within my legal authority to move things along." "Great. Thanks, Annette. I knew we could count on you. Family sticks together, right? Let me know the minute the wire instructions are confirmed." He hung up without waiting for an answer. Family sticks together. If you've ever had to smile at someone who just spat in your face because you were waiting for the right moment to show them the mirror, you know the kind of self-control it takes to keep your voice steady. It's a quiet, burning discipline. I replaced the receiver on its cradle and took a slow, deep breath. 2 minutes later, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a text from Valerie. "Annette, I know things were tense on Saturday, but we are in a crisis. Julian is facing ridiculous charges. Richard is completely stressed about the North Division deal. Please make sure you push those papers through today. We need that money. I'm sure you understand how important a young man's future is. Let me know when it's done." I stared at the words on the screen. How important a young man's future is. She was still doing it. Even now, with her son's mugshot plastered on the local news, she was still holding on to the delusion that Julian's future was the only one that mattered. She expected me to play the role of the quiet, obedient sister who sweeps their mess under the rug. But as an escrow processor, my loyalty isn't to my family's vanity. My loyalty is to the ledger, and the ledger must balance. I stood up and walked over to Darlene's desk. She was chewing on a peppermint, her screen filled with the title registry for the Liberty Lake property. "Darlene," I said quietly, leaning over her partition, "we need to handle the rejected deed of trust on Richard's lake house." The lender, Mountain Crest Financial, needs to be notified that their security instrument was rejected by the county auditor due to the defective legal description. Darlene looked up, her sharp eyes twinkling behind her reading glasses. Standard procedure is to send a correction notice to the closing attorney and the lender simultaneously, right? Exactly, I said. And since the lender's wire for the $1 million equity contribution has already been deposited into our trust account, they need to know that their loan is currently unsecured. If we don't disclose the rejection immediately, we're in violation of our fiduciary duty to the lender. And what about the pending writ of attachment on Pioneer Holdings? Darlene asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. The victim's attorney filed the emergency petition this morning. It hasn't been signed by the judge yet, but under our underwriting guidelines, any pending litigation that threatens the solvency of the borrowing entity must be disclosed to the primary lender before we can issue a title policy. Yes, I said, a cold, clear certainty washing over me. We must notify Columbia River Capital. They are the primary lender putting up the $3.2 million. They have a right to know that their borrower's corporate assets are about to be frozen by a court order. I went back to my desk and pulled up the blank Notice of Material Change forms. These are standard, dry, legal disclosures. They aren't dramatic, they don't contain angry words or emotional pleas. They are written in the sterile, unyielding language of commercial real estate law. I began to type. 2. Mountain Crest Financial, Bridge Lender. Regarding escrow, number 4492 AS, Pioneer Holdings, LLC. Notice is hereby given that the deed of trust securing the short-term loan on the real property located at 14120E. Liberty Lake Drive has been rejected for recording by the Spokane County Auditor due to a defective legal description. Incorrect plat map reference, page 14, book 9. The funds currently held in trust, $1,000 are uncollateralized as of this date. Next, I drafted the disclosure for Columbia River Capital, the primary lender. 2. Columbia River Capital, primary commercial lender. Regarding acquisition loan, North Division, Commercial Plaza. Please be advised of a material change in the financial and legal status of the borrowing entity, Pioneer Holdings, LLC. An emergency petition for a prejudgment writ of attachment, Spokane County Superior Court, case number 24-2098812, has been filed against the assets of Pioneer Holdings, LLC, stemming from a vehicular assault incident involving a corporate registered vehicle on August 11th. Under Section 4.2 of your lending covenants, this filing constitutes a material adverse change. If you've never worked in finance, let me explain what these two documents represent. They are the legal equivalent of pulling the bottom two cards out of a 5-story house of cards. Richard had built his entire deal on the assumption that he could keep the rejected deed of trust quiet until Friday, fix the clerical error behind closed doors, and close the deal before the victim's attorney could get a judge to sign the writ of attachment. He thought he could outrun the clock. But he had forgotten that I am the clock. I didn't send the emails immediately. In commercial escrow, timing is everything. If I sent them too early on Monday, Richard's high-priced corporate attorneys might have had time to scramble, find a private hard money lender, or file emergency motions to salvage the transaction. But if I waited until Wednesday morning, the exact deadline for the final loan approval and the release of the non-refundable earnest money, the trap would snap shut with absolute mathematical precision. I saved the drafts in my secure queue, setting the auto-send timer for Wednesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. That evening, I drove home to our modest bungalow in North Spokane. The summer heat was still heavy, the air thick with the smell of dry pine and asphalt. When I walked through the front door, I found Leo sitting at the laminate kitchen table. He had a yellow rubber squeeze ball in his hand, his fingers working slowly, methodically, to rebuild the grip strength he had lost in the crash. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice slow, his eyes bright. I practiced walking to the corner and back today. Only took me 10 minutes. No falling. I felt a lump rise in my throat, hot and tight. I walked over and squeezed his shoulder, looking at the determination in his young face. This was the boy my sister had dismissed as having no future. This was the child who had spent months learning how to swallow, how to speak, how to hold a pencil again, while his cousins drove luxury cars and drank expensive wine on lake docks. "I'm so proud of you, Leo," I whispered, leaning down to press my forehead against his hair. "You are the strongest person I know." "Did Uncle Richard close his big deal?" Leo asked, his brow furrowing as he struggled to find the words. I don't want you to be stressed, Mom. We don't need their money. We don't need a single penny of their money, sweetie," I said, looking around our clean, humble kitchen. "And as for Richard's deal, the law is going to take care of that. You just focus on getting stronger." I sat down across from him, pulling a yellow legal pad toward me. I began to write down our monthly budget, calculating the exact amount we needed to cover Leo's next round of specialized neurotherapy. It was a tight squeeze, as always, but as I looked at the numbers, I felt no fear. I felt only the deep, quiet satisfaction of a woman who knows that the ledger of our lives is about to be balanced, down to the very last cent. The countdown had begun, and Richard and Valerie were still sleeping in their expensive, white-on-white house, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over their manicured lawns. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of pale, heavy gray sky that often hangs over the Spokane River before a late summer storm. I sat at my desk at Inland Empire Title and Escrow, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound in my small cubicle. On my desk sat my chipped blue ceramic mug, filled with black coffee, and my worn brass measuring tape. I kept my fingers resting on the smooth metal of the tape, letting its weight anchor me. At exactly 8 a.m., my computer screen flickered, the outbox cleared. The automated system had just delivered the 2 Notice of Material Change disclosures to the respective lenders. In the world of high-stakes real estate, those emails were the equivalent of dropping a lighted match into a dry timber yard. I knew exactly what would happen next. I knew the algorithms at the banks would flag the notices within minutes. I knew the underwriters in Seattle would look at the words uncollateralized funds and prejudgment writ of attachment, and their hands would freeze over their keyboards. If you've ever had to sit and wait for the consequences of someone else's cruelty to finally catch up with them, you know that the minutes stretch out like hours. You don't feel happy. You don't feel giddy. You just feel a deep, quiet stillness. By 10:15 a.m., the storm broke. The glass double doors of our lobby didn't just open. They rattled on their hinges as Richard and Valerie stormed inside. Richard's expensive silk tie was loosened, his collar damp with sweat, his face the color of spoiled milk. Valerie was right behind him, her heavy gold bangles clinking like warning bells, her face twisted into a mask of pure, frantic panic. She wasn't wearing her pristine white linen dress today. She was wearing tight designer jeans and a black silk blouse, but she looked completely disheveled, her perfect hair starting to fray at the temples. Darlene, bless her heart, was already standing near the reception desk. She didn't flinch. She just slipped a peppermint candy into her cheek, picked up a stack of folders, and gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. "Where is she?" Richard roared, his voice echoing off the sterile drywall of the lobby. "Where is Annette?" I didn't hide. I didn't cower in my cubicle. I stood up, smoothed the front of my simple $10 department store slacks, and walked out into the hallway. "I'm right here, Richard," I said, my voice calm, even, and steady. "Please, let's take this into the conference room. We don't need to disrupt the rest of the office." "Disrupt?" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking as she pushed past her husband. "You've ruined us, Annette. You've completely destroyed our family. What did you send to our lenders?" I led them into conference room B. It was a small, functional room with a laminate table, a few cheap padded chairs, and a window that looked out over the gravel parking lot and the dumpster out back. It was a far cry from the glass and timber luxury of their Liberty Lake estate, but it was where the real work got done. Richard slammed his leather briefcase onto the table, his hands shaking. "I just got a call from the regional vice president at Columbia River Capital. They've suspended our $3.2 million acquisition loan, and Mountain Crest is demanding the immediate return of the $1 million wire. They're threatening to sue me for fraud, Annette. Fraud. If you've ever had to sit in a room with people who think their money makes them untouchable, you know the exact kind of quiet I'm talking about. It's the silence that comes right before the lightning strikes." I sat down at the table, folding my hands over my yellow legal pad. "I didn't commit fraud, Richard," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. "And neither did Inland Empire Title. As the escrow officer on this transaction, I have a strict legal, fiduciary duty to disclose any material changes to the lending institutions before closing. When the county auditor rejected the deed of trust on your Liberty Lake home due to your attorney's clerical error, your bridge loan became completely unsecured. You were holding $1 million of their money with zero collateral. If I hadn't disclosed that, I would be complicit in a felony." "It was a typo!" Richard screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "A simple map reference error. My attorney was going to record the correction on Monday afternoon." "But he didn't," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than his shouting. "Because on Monday morning, the Spokane County Superior Court received an emergency petition for a prejudgment writ of attachment against Pioneer Holdings, LLC. The attorney representing the family of the young girl Julian hit on Sunday night filed it to freeze your corporate assets. Under federal banking covenants, I am legally required to disclose any pending litigation that threatens the solvency of the borrowing entity. If I had concealed that petition from Columbia River Capital, I would have lost my license, and our company would have been liable for millions." Valerie took a step toward me, her eyes wild, her fingers clawing at the edge of the laminate table. "You did this on purpose. You've been planning this. You're using some stupid bureaucratic paperwork to punish us because you're jealous. You've always been jealous of my home, my husband, and my son." I looked at my sister. I looked at the expensive gold watch on her wrist, the diamond rings on her fingers, and the absolute lack of grace in her eyes. "I have never been jealous of you, Valerie," I said softly. "I have spent 30 years making sure that people's homes are legally theirs, that their debts are paid, and that the truth is recorded. I don't care about your glass walls or your imported beef, but I do care about my son." "This is about the barbecue?" Valerie gasped, letting out a harsh, hysterical laugh. "Are you seriously destroying our lives over a stupid hamburger? Julian is facing prison, Annette. He's 19. He has his whole life ahead of him. He was supposed to go to law school in the fall. Do you know what a criminal record will do to his future?" There it was, the word, future. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I felt the cold, hard weight of my brass measuring tape in my pocket, and I thought of Leo standing on that cedar deck, his hand shaking, his face burning with a shame he did not earn. "On Saturday, Valerie, you looked my son in the eye, a boy who survived a head-on collision, who spent 3 weeks in a coma, and who works every single day just to learn how to speak and walk again. And you told him he didn't deserve a burger because he didn't have a future. You patted his cheek and told him to go boil a cheap hot dog in the kitchen." Valerie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to Richard, then back to me, her chest heaving. "I didn't scream at you," I continued, my voice steady, matching the rhythm of the ticking clock on the wall. "I didn't make a scene. I just took my son home, and I did my job. And in doing my job, I found out that your golden boy, the one with the real future, was driving a corporate-registered vehicle while intoxicated, hit an innocent girl, put her in the ICU, and tried to run away like a coward. His future isn't ruined because of my escrow disclosures, Valerie. His future is ruined because of his own actions. And your husband's deal is ruined because he tried to build a real estate empire on a foundation of cards and lies." Richard slumped into his chair, the anger suddenly draining out of him, leaving him looking small, hollow, and old. He stared at his leather briefcase as if he couldn't remember what was inside it. "The seller," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "The seller is going to default me. My $150,000 earnest money deposit. It's non-refundable after today." "Yes," I said, pulling a fresh document from my folder. "The purchase and sale agreement states that if the buyer fails to secure financing and close by Wednesday at 5 o'clock, the contract is null and void, and the earnest money is forfeited to the seller. Your lenders have officially withdrawn their loan commitments." "The deal is dead, Richard. We'll lose the lake house," Valerie whispered, her voice suddenly small, her eyes wide with a terror she had never known before. "The bridge loan. If they recall the $1 million and we don't have it, they will foreclose," I said simply. "They have already initiated the default process. The paperwork was filed at 9:30 this morning. Valerie looked at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. She didn't see the quiet, tired sister who processed papers in the back office anymore. She saw the woman who held the pen. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. I slid it across the laminate table, placing it right in front of Richard's trembling hands. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That," I said, "is the backup purchase agreement for the North Division Commercial Plaza. The seller has already signed it. The backup buyer is the Inland Northwest Neuro Rehabilitation Foundation. They are a non-profit group that provides free physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation to brain injury survivors. The very clinic that Leo has been waiting on a list to get into for 18 months. I watched as the realization washed over my brother-in-law's face. "Because your transaction defaulted this morning," I said. "The foundation's backup contract has officially been elevated to the primary position. They are purchasing the building using a state grant. There will be no corporate development. There will be no luxury strip mall. There will only be a place where young people who actually need help can go to rebuild their lives." I stood up, picking up my yellow legal pad and my blue ceramic mug. I looked down at my sister, whose eyes were filled with tears of anger, fear, and defeat. "I believe you said it yourself on Saturday, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing in the small, quiet conference room. "We really only have room for the young people with a real future ahead of them. It turns out the universe has a very different definition of what that future looks like." I turned and walked out of the room, the heavy solid wood door clicking shut behind me with a final satisfying snap. The sound of a heavy oak door closing in an escrow office is a very specific kind of quiet. It doesn't slam, it seals. It carries the weight of finality, the physical manifestation of a transaction that has reached its absolute end. When I walked back to my desk after leaving Valerie and Richard in conference room B, the office was completely still. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tap of Darlene's keyboard were the only sounds left in the world. Darlene didn't say a word as I sat down. She didn't ask what had happened, and she didn't offer any cheap words of triumph. She simply reached over the low partition, took my empty blue ceramic mug, and walked down the hall to the break room. When she came back, the mug was filled with fresh, hot black coffee, steam rising in lazy curls into the dry office air. She set it down next to my worn brass measuring tape, gave my shoulder a firm, brief squeeze, and went back to her desk. That is the kind of friendship that doesn't need a ledger. It is a quiet, steady bond built over decades of shared lunches, cheap creamer, and the silent understanding of what it takes for a mother to survive. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the North Division transaction was officially dead. The seller's attorney had already delivered the formal notice of termination to our office, and Richard's $150,000 earnest money deposit was transferred from our trust account directly to the seller as liquidated damages. It was over. The house of cards had collapsed, and the legal machinery of the financial world was already moving on to the next file. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was as methodical as it was devastating. In Spokane County, foreclosure auctions happen on the front steps of the old brick courthouse on Broadway Avenue, right under the shadow of the Gothic towers. It is a cold, public place where dreams are sold to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. In late October, I took my lunch break and walked down to the courthouse steps. I stood in the back of the small crowd, the autumn wind whipping fallen maple leaves across the concrete, and watched as the deed to the sprawling, white-on-white glass estate on Liberty Lake was sold back to the primary mortgage holder. Richard and Valerie had been given 30 days to vacate. I didn't feel a sense of joy watching that gavel fall. If you've ever had to rebuild your own life from the absolute ground up, you know that watching someone else's ruin doesn't make your own foundation any stronger. It just makes you quiet. I thought about Valerie's pristine white linen dress and her sparkling diamond tennis bracelet, now likely sitting in a safety deposit box, or sold to pay for Julian's defense attorneys. They had moved into a small, rented duplex in Spokane Valley, a place with beige carpets and a view of a gravel parking lot. It was a modest life, the very kind of life Valerie had spent her entire adulthood looking down on. Julian's trial took place in the winter. The young girl he had hit, a 20-year-old nursing student named Clara, survived her injuries, though she faced a lifetime of physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation. Because of the severity of the crash and Julian's attempt to flee the scene, the state didn't offer a lenient plea deal. The Golden Boy, the young man with the guaranteed spot at a Seattle law school, was sentenced to 4 years at the Airway Heights Correction Center. His future wasn't stolen from him. He had traded it away on a dark road for a temporary rush of adrenaline and a complete lack of responsibility. I know some of you sitting at your own kitchen tables tonight might be wondering if I ever spoke to my sister again. You might be wondering if the blood in our veins was enough to bridge the massive chasm her cruelty had dug between us. If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with your own family, you know that reconciliation isn't a neat, clean line. It is messy, lukewarm, and often deeply unsatisfying. My mother, Beatrice, came to my bungalow on a Tuesday evening in November. The first frost of the season had turned the grass on my small front lawn into brittle, silver needles. She didn't wear her designer sunglasses today. She looked her age, 81, with deep lines etched around her eyes and her shoulders slightly stooped under a simple wool coat. She sat at my laminate kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea I had poured for her. "Valerie is broken, Annette," my mother said, her voice thin and fragile, like dry parchment. "She won't leave the house. She won't talk to anyone. She thinks you hate her." I sat across from her, my fingers tracing the familiar laminate pattern of the table where I had spent so many nights calculating Leo's medical bills. "I don't hate her, Mom," I said softly, "but I love my son more than I value her comfort. I spent years watching this family treat Leo like he was a broken toy, an inconvenience that should be kept out of sight. I stayed quiet because I thought peace was something you could buy with silence. It isn't." My mother looked down at her tea, her eyes shiny with tears she didn't let fall. "I should have said something at the barbecue," she whispered. "I saw his face when she told him about the burgers. I saw how small he looked. I was so tired of the fighting, Annette. I wanted things to be perfect." "Nothing is perfect, Mom," I said, reaching across the table to gently touch her hand. "But some things are true. And the truth is, Leo has a future. It just doesn't look like Julian's. We didn't hug. We didn't have a grand emotional breakthrough. But when she left that night, she left a small, faded cardboard box on my counter. Inside were Leo's old childhood drawings, the ones he had made before the accident, the ones Valerie had supposedly lost during a spring cleaning years ago. My mother had saved them. It was a small, quiet gesture of remorse, a lukewarm peace offering from a woman who had finally realized that looking away from cruelty is its own kind of betrayal. In January, the Inland Northwest Neuro-Rehabilitation Foundation officially opened its doors in the newly renovated commercial plaza on North Division. I attended the opening ceremony on a crisp, bright Friday morning. The building looked beautiful. The nonprofit had stripped away the cold corporate facade Richard had planned, replacing it with warm cedar accents, wide, accessible walkways, and large windows that let the winter sunlight flood into the therapy rooms. The air smelled of fresh paint, rubber flooring, and the rich, clean scent of lavender oil. Leo walked in beside me, his hand resting lightly on my forearm. He still had his heavy limp, and his left hand was still tucked slightly against his chest, but his head was held high. When we reached the main gymnasium, a beautiful open space filled with parallel bars, colorful therapy balls, and state-of-the-art balance equipment, the director of the foundation, a kind, gray-haired woman named Sarah, walked up to us with a bright smile. "Annette, Leo," Sarah said, shaking our hands warmth. "We've been waiting for you. Leo, your first official assessment is scheduled for Monday morning. We've got a spot reserved for you with our senior neurological specialist." Leo looked around the room, his eyes wide and bright. He looked at the other young people in the gym, some in wheelchairs, some taking slow, halting steps with the help of therapists, all of them working, fighting, and striving to reclaim their lives. For the first time in 2 years, Leo didn't look like the only broken person in the room. He looked like he belonged. He looked like he was home. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice slow, deliberate, and entirely free of the shame that had weighed him down on Valerie's deck. I am ready to work. I watched him walk over to one of the stationary therapy bikes, his limp pronounced but his stride steady. He chatted with one of the young assistants, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face as he figured out how to adjust the pedals. If you have ever carried a heavy load for a long time, you know the exact moment your shoulders finally realize the weight is gone. It doesn't happen with a shout or a cheer. It happens with a long, slow breath out. I stood there by the window, the winter sun warming my face, and I felt that weight slide off my back and dissolve into the clean, bright air of the clinic. We had built this. Not with millions of dollars, not with loud voices or expensive white estates, but with the quiet, meticulous truth of a paper trail and the unyielding strength of a mother's love. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, solid metal of my brass measuring tape. I had carried it for 25 years, using it to measure boundaries, to verify dimensions, and to ensure that everything was in its proper place. But as I looked at my son, who was currently laughing with his therapist, his face bright with hope and determination, I realized that some things can never be measured. Love is not a line item in a budget. Dignity is not a corporate asset. And a child's future is not something that can be decided by the wealthy or the cruel on a sunny afternoon by the lake. I took a slow sip of my coffee, turned my back on the past, and walked toward the parallel bars where my son was waiting for me, ready to take his next hard, beautiful step forward.